So this is the title of the overall project that NASA funded about a year ago now. And I'll tell you a little bit of the history of how it came together, and then what we're planning to do, and then why we've assembled this symposium and the working groups, and what we're trying to get out of it. So, just use the there we go. Yeah. That's good. Check this on. All right, so a little bit about the project involved is Antonio Ferraz at JPL with myself, Walter and Scott, and other people that are contributing from Walter's lab, Martin Wachtelski, who you're going to hear from in a bit, Ian Brosnan, who's at NASA Ames, who's collaborating with Susan Delacruz, who's also based at Moffett Field, jointly with NASA Ames. And all of you. So, okay. So to kick things off, this is a video from hundreds of contributors to MoveBank, starting with white storks in Germany, and you're seeing them move south to their wintering habitat in Africa, and it's going to zoom in now onto Cape Buffalo, no, to water buffalo. And the reason I'm putting this video here is, one, it's spectacularly beautiful, and two, is to give you the global scope of animal tracking data, and the view that it's more than just an individual collection of movements for individual studies, but it's a way to understand the Earth at large, and that it's becoming an Earth observation. Set some more context, I probably don't have to tell anyone in this room, but biodiversity loss is an immense challenge for humanity in this century, and that is recognized both from the World Economic Forum, from business leaders and economic leaders, as well as a survey from Future Earth, that it's in the top 3 challenges that we are facing collectively, both in terms of potential impact and likelihood. And that there's a need to turn that around, and to turn that around, we need to be able to monitor change, and this is coming out of the last IPBES assessment from Sandra Diaz, paper in Science, showing that our ability to track that change is poor across a lot of metrics, including ones that are related to animal tracking, for example, habitat loss. Again, I don't need to tell most of the people in this room, but animals are important for all kinds of reasons, whether it's pest control, pollination, seed dispersal, we eat them. They're carriers of disease, and we all just lived through a pandemic. They could be sentinels of disaster and predicting potentially earthquakes and volcanoes. Navigational hazards, remember the incident with Captain Sully landed not too far from here over in New York in the East River. They're hugely important to global biogeochemical cycles. There's a bunch of bird poop there. Phosphorus redistribution, and they can be sensor platforms for understanding other aspects of the Earth system, and you'll hear more about that in some of the talks coming up in the next couple of days. They're important for recreation. I'm sure many of you are birders, for tourism, moral and ethical reasons, for conserving wildlife, and they're important to many people's spiritual lives. So overall, they're important. They're in threats. We need to do something about it, and summarize that to understanding where, when, and how animals interact with and move through and between habitats is essential to crafting successful management plans to conserve all of those things that I just talked about. So let's take a step back. 1962. So that's what, 60 years ago. That's crazy. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And I apologize for not doing that in the thick Massachusetts accent. But if you listen or read the whole speech, he mentions the other things. So some of the other things that he mentions are things like climbing Mount Everest or rice playing Texas. But some of the other things that he mentions in the speech are Earth observations. So he, in that speech, was laying out a vision for NASA and the federal government at large that was going to use space for peaceful objectives to improve life here on Earth. He mentioned storms and wildfires, icebergs. He didn't mention animal tracking, but it wasn't too long after that. In 1965, the director of the Smithsonian called up someone at NASA and said, hey, why can't we track animals from space? And by 1966, the NASA and the Smithsonian had convened a workshop in this area. By 1969, the National Academy panel had recommended a full program in this area combining experts in ecology and the use of multispectral sensing devices, remote sensing. And by 1970, they had already launched a payload, which is an amazing pace of activity for space missions, for anyone who's been involved in one. And in 1970, NASA, the Smithsonian, and USGS tracked Monique, the space elk, for 3 months. She wore this awful, 15-pound collar around her neck. Probably wouldn't pass animal welfare guidelines today. And there was a ton of activity, mostly led out of NASA Ames, where Ian Brosnan is located. Throughout the 70s, NASA convened a number of workshops. They had a whole-of-government approach to it, with participation from everyone from the Atomic Energy Commission to Fish and Wildlife, the FAA, Smithsonian, as well as universities, state agencies in 42 states, NGOs, industry groups. They came up with, they did technical development on shrinking down tags from that 15-pound collar to something that could fit onto raptors and large seabirds. They had a 234-page plan of everything that they were going to continue to do going forward. NASA did contribute to the early development of Argos, which is still used today, particularly in the marine realm. But more or less, by the early 80s, NASA kind of got out of the animal tracking game when the Reagan administration came in. But progress continued, obviously. We're here today, and all of you have some connection to animal tracking. And by the mid-80s, people were tracking raptors and seabirds with satellites. And then, in the last 10, 15 years, with the development of Icarus, this is an example diagram of an Icarus tag, now can track even smaller animals, down to 5 gram tags that are very capable with a number of sensors. Global system that was working for a while before it was shut off due to the war. Simultaneous communication with many tags, extremely low tag mass size, and the ISS, so it wasn't quite global coverage, but close to it, so you're able to record walking distance, migration patterns, and also a solar panel with a battery on board so you can track the animals over a long time period. And there were a number of agencies, including Fish and Wildlife, and some of the people in this room contributed to this. So these agencies came to NASA through a process called the Satellite Needs Working Group. And they said, we think Icarus is really cool. It would be cool if NASA were to help the federal government develop a system to do this over the long term. And some things through a series of interviews. They liked the low tag mass, but they wanted to be able to track many different taxa. They liked the global coverage, the long duration of those Icarus tags, high frequency data that you can get from GPS tagging as opposed to passive. Low latency is important for being able to get the information off of the tag into MoveBank and usable by managers, researchers. Moderate precision in terms of geolocation, and ultimately a low cost per tag enables a high number of tags to be used. And importantly for agencies, if you put something in space for 3 years, you're not going to be able to change the processes of how people do things. You need to have some understanding that the capability is going to be around for a while. So more or less, it's time for a new and improved wildlife monitoring program plan. And NASA went to the White House and suggested this. I'll go through some of the activities that this new activity that NASA is doing is currently doing. So part of the reason that we're here today is understanding the needs of the animal tracking community. So we're compiling a comprehensive set of animal movement science questions and applications objectives, developing something called a science traceability matrix, and I'll talk about a little bit about that in a minute. And then characterizing the community of practice. And we just had a meeting with Wild Labs. They might have reached out to some of you. They're also doing that, so we're going to work together with them. But we're understanding which organizations are using or could use animal tracking data, how they use the data, what other related Earth observation data they might use or could use, and what are your pain points in terms of what isn't currently working. We're also tasked with reporting back to NASA on a number of things related to the technological and ethical regulatory trade space for designing future Internet of Animal systems. So understanding RF spectrum use, which is regulated at the national and international level, animal welfare, protecting the location of red-listed species, making sure that the system isn't used by malactors to do things like stalk their ex-girlfriend, and making sure all of that fits with NASA's open science policy. Understanding the technological and commercial space in terms of who are the current players, and I mentioned Icarus, I mentioned Argos, there's a diversity of tag vendors out there, there's the MoveBank data system, and then what are the gaps there, and then looking both at NASA's technology portfolio, the commercial sector, the international sector, of what could be infused into a next generation observing system. Bringing that all together and then working with partners, some of you in this room, international partners like the Icarus Consortium led by Max Planck for Animal Behavior, to design a system or system of systems to accomplish the objectives that I mentioned earlier. There's be some technical developments in this project. And then integrating movement data products. So going beyond just collecting locations and storing them in MoveBank, but creating higher level data products from that movement data. And you'll hear more about that in the talks this week as well. And then connecting that with what I call a golden age of biodiversity remote sensing. So there are a number of new and upcoming satellite data products from LiDAR to characterize forest structure, and from hyperspectral satellites that are starting to come online, and we'll be doing global mapping by the end of this decade, that would give us just an incredible new view of the Earth's surface, and connecting that with things like species and habitat. And then all of this is part of embedded in a conversation. There's all kinds of other things that are going on in terms of biodiversity monitoring, drones and camera traps and acoustics and eDNA. And the purpose of this workshop is to understand the needs in animal tracking, particularly as it's focused on spaceborne, what spaceborne animal tracking contribute. But obviously that fits in a broader ecosystem. And there's also a conversation going on about bringing that all together into a global biodiversity information system or observing system. So understand the context there. And then finally, a bit of community building. We're thinking about doing online summer school type of thing. And then most importantly, in terms of community building, is getting this community, the animal tracking community, engaged in something called the Earth Science Decadal Survey process. So every 10 years, the national academies in the US write a report for NASA and NOAA and USGS, telling them what your priority should be for the next 10 years. So the last one came out in 2018, January of 2018, although it's referred to as the 2017 Decadal Survey. It's 850 pages long. It lays out all the priorities for things that NASA should be doing basically in the 2020s. It does not mention animal tracking one time. It doesn't mention telemetry except for one mention of Argos in a row of an appendix, I think it's Appendix C, and purely as a geophysical observing system. And it did lay out for the first time, it listed as a most important question, what is the structure, function, and biodiversity of Earth's ecosystems, how is it changing and why? But if you read them in the text, it's mostly referring to like vegetation biodiversity, but we want to change that. So we want to help you all engage in this process. They put out RFIs, there's a process for white papers. We want to overwhelm them so that when the 2028 or 2027 decadal survey comes out, there's enough material for them to write a whole chapter on why animal tracking from space is important. I'll just mention that we will have a postdoc opening coming up soon at JPL, so that can talk to me if you're a PhD student or postdoc now looking for another postdoc opportunity. And then I'll leave it here, and maybe we'll come back to that at the very end, sort of related to the science traceability. Thank you.